Hello there, and welcome back to the Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. I'm joined today by Andrew Withers, who is the Southwest Regional Co-Ordinator for the Libertarian Party. How are you doing over there?
Not too bad.
Well, the first topic of conversation today is on the George Floyd protests and the riots that have ensued, which have intensified since last week. Some of the notable developments have included the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston and the graffitiing of Sir Winston Churchill's statue at Westminster. Now, we've seen graphic and disturbing images of violent confrontation, many of the participants of which have violated the social distancing measures, which so many of them were sticking to like glue up until about a fortnight ago. So the hypocrisy and double standards really knows no bounds. The major issue here isn't race, really. It's political violence in the form of police brutality. And it's important to remember that every ethnic group is affected by this. Police brutality is as wrong to a white person as it is to a black person or a person of any other ethnicity. And the protesters have demonstrated by rioting, looting shops, damaging infrastructure, defacing the war memorials, assaulting innocent bystanders, assaulting good genuine police officers, assaulting black people who didn't stand with them, and they've harmed the police cavalry as well. I think they're really presenting themselves as some of the very worst representatives of their cause within an otherwise harmonious multiculture. And when people say that all lives matter, they're not being racist, they're simply saying what's right and just. Life matters more than anything else, and that's the real message that should be uniting everyone. I, for one, would advocate saving all lives as opposed to just some of them in this respect. And as the saying goes, you can't fight fire with fire. Would you agree that police brutality is the central issue here and not race?
I've got a saying which is, give an idiot a uniform. I mean, you only have to look in our own country. The day after the lockdown legislation was brought in Somerset, we had the local chief, Bobby, was actually out there setting up roadblocks. The police, unfortunately, is something that's always going to attract this sort of personality. But we're fairly fortunate that the vast majority of them are in there to do a job, and they do see themselves as working within the community. Police brutality is always going to be something that we're going to live with. If you have a uniformed force that has got the monopoly of violence, it will happen. What has happened in the Floyd case is that it was filmed, and we were all witnesses to it, which is the reason why people are frankly appalled. So police brutality is fundamental to all of this. But on top of that, you've actually got people who are manipulating after 200 years of the slave trade being abolished, who are manipulating race for identity politics. The fact that Biden said, if you're black and you don't vote for me, or you vote for Trump, you are not a proper black person. I mean, where does this insanity come from? If you're going to have an armed force, you're going to have to accept that there is actually going to be abuse. We've seen that over and over again. And you're going to have to accept that unless you've actually got some constraints on these police officers, that it will happen. And that there's no point even pretending that it won't. Now, literally, I just think what happened in Minneapolis, what the heck that has actually got to do with the United Kingdom, where we've still got a largely unarmed police force and largely, probably right up until the COVID situation, well respected. I really don't understand what the connection is between the US and the UK. It's almost like it was actually being coordinated across two continents. So, yes, I agree that it is police brutality, and I think when you've actually got advancement through the police force is through being an effective member of common purpose, I think we've got deep problems there because it's not reflective of society. And we've had policemen bending the knee, as it's euphemistically called, which I'm sorry, is shaming, and it is also setting yourself up and picking sides. So yes, police brutality was the trigger, but there are people out there, and I personally believe that Antifa or anybody associated with them needs to be prescribed as a terrorist organisation, are actually manipulating the situation and are actually causing hate. We've had a black woman police officer in New York who was shot at point blank range by another black guy. He was just sitting in the car having a coffee, Once you start violence, it begets violence, and this has got to be clamped down on one way or the other. Both the police brutality in the States, I would argue there's less of it in the UK, but certainly anybody who's actually masking up, going armed to demonstrations with flares to fire at police horses, I think you've actually got a terrorist organisation going on there. So there's two edges to the same coin there.
A lot of people are motivated by emotion nowadays in political terms. Do you think that we're at or reaching the zenith of feeling triumphing over facts?
Yeah, I think so. Education is about teaching somebody to think, not what to think. And literally, it's all about, oh, this is wrong and this is right. But there is no intellectual rigor in actually saying, well, how can we do this better? Should we do this better? Should we hold on to what is good about our society? No, this all just feels bad. The UBI debate about everybody just having a state income, I just can't believe that that is actually being seriously proposed by a Conservative government. Although apparently Boris has actually ruled it out of court, but that remains to be seen. That is just out and out socialism, but what people never ever take on because they don't reason things through. The state has no money of its own. It either prints it, borrows it, or takes it, or as libertarians would say, steals it without consent from the public. So yes, I think we are probably, I don't know whether we're at the zenith, I think we've probably got some way to go yet, where emotion is everything rather than reason. And I actually put that down to the breakdown of education.
Right, just going on to the coronavirus and the lockdown. Britain has recorded the lowest daily rise in coronavirus deaths since before the lockdown was instigated, while the number of new cases is also at a post-lockdown low. Are there really any excuses left for not ending the lockdown now?
No. Next question.
What lasting damage do you think the lockdown will cause in social and economic terms?
Mass unemployment. The Bank of England optimistically predicting a V-shaped recovery. I think there is a bit of pent-up demand, but I don't see it lasting that long. My fury at the moment is actually directed at Priti Patel, who, for the sake of not being allowed to get on TV, to introduce a policy which virtually everybody in business has said is insane, the 14-day quarantine. That should have been at the beginning of the epidemic, not towards the end. We are a country that trades, and we've got 3 airlines that are actually suing the government. I know so many people who have been so badly affected by this mentally. Just being locked in a house. It's a house arrest. I don't know how else to, when you've done nothing wrong and you're just confined to 4 walls, and some people have not got access to the countryside or parks and everything else. This has to end, and it has to end now. And as far as I'm concerned, they can't repeal the COVID Act 2020 quick enough.
Obviously, it's been a very unnatural experience, quite unlike anything that we've seen since the Second World War. But do you find it scary how people have been so willing to trust the government on the lockdown, despite the fact that their modelling has been completely faulty and their guidance anti-scientific? And what are the implications of this misplaced trust for future events?
It will have a knock-on effect. This government has been caught lying and lying and lying again. It hides behind the shield of, oh, we're following the science. And I'm no scientist. I'm not a virologist. But all I'm seeing is 2 separate schools of thought. One is I believe, the Oxford University School of Thought. And the other one is what was coming out of Imperial. Their methodology just seems to be purposefully corrupted and doesn't stand up. And what was worse is that they were refusing to go and offer peer review of their data until we were halfway into this. The bit that actually seriously concerns me, and I picked up on it before lockdown, was on the 19th of March, the Public Health England issued a statement. It was on the 19th of March, it's online, that COVID-19 presented no serious threat to public health. 4 days later, we were in lockdown. What happened in that 4 days? Now, my view on this, and I will not be around in 30 years' time when the cabinet minutes come out, is I think there was a cabinet revolt. I am led to believe that Matt Hancock and probably 10 others threatened to resign en masse unless they did have a lockdown. And it was his signature that was on the rules, as they called it. It was his signature. Boris Johnson is politically adept enough not to put his signature on it.
Mm.
Now, that is what's actually being fed back to me, is there was a cabinet revolt, because we seem to have actually gone from following the Swedish model to overnight total lockdown, and then clearing all of the hospitals' ICU beds of people who were sick. And this is what has made the situation far, far worse, is returning these old people who should have been protected to care homes. I mean, we have actually got our statistics changed halfway through this, because they weren't even counting care home deaths. Now, I'm not going to make any pronouncement on the science. I've had multiple arguments on this because I'm not a scientist. All I can see is that we're going to end up with a high rate of suicide, which is already starting to happen. I bet that deaths from cancer, heart disease, and other stuff where people are not being treated or getting hospital appointments, I bet you that is not going to be counted. I bet you those death certificates are not going to be released at 5 p.m. every day by the government. Just to finally finish off this point, these 5 o'clock briefings were there to calm a panic-stricken nation, and progressively, as you watch them, they just went on to be a Conservative Party political broadcast. And slowly, one by one, people were switching off, to the point now where I don't think we've even got the ones at weekends now.
It certainly seems as though a few inquiries ought to be made, but there's absolutely no challenge to the government's U-turn, what was a very clear U-turn in mid-March.
Yeah, 4 days. 4 days between an official document saying that it proposed no threat to the population, to 3 days later we're all locked in our houses.
We were supposed to be in this for 3 weeks. We're now nearly 3 months through it.
Well, the legislation, COVID-19 Act 2020, gives government power 2 years.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. They could have actually done this on the Civil Contingencies Act quite easily. The maximum time that was allowed, 6 months. Why 2 years? Deeply suspect.
All the more reason why we've got to be the difference.
Yeah, exactly.
Just moving on to the presidential elections in the United States. The US economy restored 2.5 million jobs in May, and that's the highest increase on record. The markets have also been benevolent, particularly the Dow Jones, which has increased by over 7,000 points from its low in late March. Now, all the factors that we've talked about so far may be crucial in deciding who wins the presidential election later this year. I've got a quote from Reuters here. Global investors seem squarely focused on the reopening of major economies after almost 3 months of coronavirus lockdowns and unprecedented central bank and government policy support for households and businesses. Stock markets are recapturing their losses as investors bet on a sharp third quarter rebound with no second wave of infections. But markets have shown remarkably little reaction to changes in polling around 2020's set-piece political event, i.e. the elections. Shifting political opinion about Washington's handling of the coronavirus and nationwide protests over the death of George Floyd have, over the past 2 weeks, transformed the odds on Donald Trump's re-election. Now, I've already spoken about the George Floyd thing, but more about the economy. Do you think the market movements are not really considering the serious economic damage that the global lockdowns have caused?
I mean, at the end of the day, Chris, what we've got to remember here is that we live in a socialist economy, which is a mixed economy, whereas the American economy is far more freewheeling and far more free market than we will ever be. We live in a state-controlled economy. I've always been baffled by left-wingers fulminating against Donald Trump as if we were part of the 51st State of the Union. Since 1783 in the Treaty of Paris, we're 2 separate countries with 2 separate trajectories. We've come together a couple of times to fight wars, but as late as 1926, the American Navy was actually carrying out military manoeuvres against the British Navy, being the military threat to America. So at the end of the day, I've never really understood why everybody is so obsessed with what's going on in America. I'm far more obsessed about what's going on in Britain, because we have got two different economies, two different economic models. I'm shooting from the lip now. I don't think in America 45% of the population work for the government, as they do in the UK.
Mm.
So we're trying to compare apples with oranges, oranges with apples. Yes, it's always very interesting to watch the American elections, especially some of the freaky green activists having complete and utter meltdowns when he was. I mean, I have to say, I still got that on loop. That gives me great pleasure. But at the end of the day, I'm rooting for Jo Jorgensen from South Carolina. I think she's going to make a far better showing than Biden, definitely, and probably he's going to make a bit of a dent in Trump. Let's see.
Do you think that the Jo Jorgensen Spike Cohen ticket will make a larger impact this year than in any other for the Libertarian Party in the US?
Yes, I do. You just look at her profile compared to Trump and compared to Biden. We need to all benefit out of Jo Jorgensen's candidature because I think she's going to do pretty well.
One of the worries is that floating voters, if they see that Joe Biden is so far ahead, as indeed the polls currently show, they may swing to Trump in order to block him. Do you think there's any risk of that happening?
No, people when they come to vote are tribal. It's very much like Labour and Conservatives. There are people who actually walk into the polling booth and haven't made their mind up until they've got the pencil in their hand. To be quite honest, I'm not a great fan of polls. The only poll that matters is the election on the day.
Absolutely. Well, just to move it on to the final topic, which is the UK economy and particularly the debt situation. I've got a quote from the Telegraph here. Assuming the Treasury Select Committee approves, the Office for Budget Responsibility will shortly have a new chairman, the former Treasury and International Monetary Fund economist Richard Hughes. With the budget deficit likely to approach a record £350 billion this year, the national debt surging to more than 100% of GDP, and the government planning an emergency post-COVID fiscal stimulus that is expected to see VAT and national insurance slashed alongside a major programme of infrastructure spending, there could scarcely be a more fiscally challenging time to be heading Britain's budgetary watchdog. And the Chancellor Rishi Sunak has already admitted that the small business loans that the government have been doling out are likely to be irrecoverable. And the budget stimulus plans have been pushed back to the autumn. The taxpayer is going to get an absolute kicking for all of the fiscal mismanagement over the past 3 months, and even more so when you consider the fact that the tax burden is at a 50-year high as it is. Would you agree that the right answer to this problem is less government and less taxes?
Yes, and yes.
What with the looming debt crisis facing Britain, how concerned should we be? Because a tax increase at this point would pretty much kill off the recovery.
I don't think the Treasury will allow this. I think all of the costs will all be rolled up and paid off, like the Second World War, will be paid off over the next 25 to 30 years. And they'll be borrowing on a massive scale. Britain's credit is pretty good. I'm not so worried about this. I think the government would rather print money than take money and have it through taxes. Because anybody who actually advocates increasing taxes is always doomed to failure. The Labour Party always go on about, everybody really, really wants to pay more for the NHS. But then you go and interview people, would you agree to pay more for the NHS? And they say, yes, of course. But what they really mean is, yes, I want somebody else to pay it more. I don't want to pay personally more income tax. Income tax now is probably at an all-time high since the 70s, when Margaret Thatcher came in, when I actually saw, quite swinging cuts in taxes, which made a huge difference to the economy. In the 1980s, we stopped propping up Rust Belt industries, and unfortunately, the NHS is effectively turning it into a Rust Belt medical delivery system that has also decided to garner itself with some sort of mystic cult of religiosity. It's going to be a tough one because the failed PFI scheme that Blair and Brown were pushing, I don't know whether you noticed that probably within the first 3 weeks of the lockdown, 17 billion was used to pay off that. So the NHS will not be saddled with that. When you're being charged 400 quid to change a light bulb under these ridiculous schemes, I don't think we'll ever revisit that again.
I'll be honest, Chris, I'm actually quite optimistic because I've actually been through some pretty bad disasters economically my last 40 years. So I'm not as pessimistic and as doom-laden as the newspapers. The newspapers need to sell misery, and God, have they actually sold that in spades.
Do you think there's any prospect of the government adopting more traditional economic methods that actually work, or will we be simply repeating the same neo-Keynesian response that brought us the botched economic recovery from the last financial crisis?
Yes, I think they would just stick to Keynesianism because it goes back to the human factor. We are investing is a euphemism for we are spending your money and we are deciding where we're going to spend your money and where we're going to borrow the money, and we are going to direct it in what is good for our party. The Conservatives and Labour Party deem the NHS to be a vote winner. I'm going to be hung for this, but actually all burnt at stake in the town square. I can see this. Anybody who criticises the NHS is just actually spitting on the graves of dead nurses. But this is going back to what you said earlier. Are we going to have a rational debate, or are we going to have the feels? We are desperately in need to have an irrational debate on the best delivery systems. And just saying, oh, well, we've got to stick with the NHS because we don't want America and Trump and chlorinated chicken, when there's 122 other delivery systems across the world we can emulate, especially the German one, which I'm a great fan of. We'll take it from there. But no, Keynes is here to stay.
Right, so how did you become a libertarian yourself, and what libertarian thinkers and texts have you encountered along the way?
Well, I think really I was fairly fortunate that I was actually born to libertarianism. Although I received an education of sorts from the state, one of the greatest influences on me was my great-grandfather. He was always telling me, sitting at his knee, he lived till he was 92, but he was always telling me that everything I was actually being taught in school was basically rubbish, mostly because he'd actually lived through most of it. He was a great supporter of Charles Bradlaugh, who was the MP for Northampton, where I originate from. And this was a chap who was actually sent back to Parliament 3 times by the good voters of Northampton after Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, kept on getting him debarred. The main thing that he was actually doing was refusing to swear by Almighty God, which Parliament took great offence to. And at one stage he was locked up in the Tower of Big Ben. And every time they barred him from sitting in Parliament because he refused to swear by Almighty God, they had another general election and the people in Northampton just sent him back again. He was one of the free thinkers. He was very much anti-socialist. He thought this was an utter disaster for the working man. He has always been one of my folk heroes, basically, coming from Northampton. His statue stands on Abington Square. Often during Rag Week, when I was a student, he seemed to be sitting there with a Poe sitting on the top of his head. And if you remember what a Poe is, he used to go underneath the bed. He was wrapped in toilet paper and all sorts of things, but he was very much an affectionate part of the Northampton character, bloody mindedness. So my great-grandfather was a great supporter of Charles Bradlaugh, and it permeated through his thinking, which permeated down to me. One of my last memories of him was every time a war came along, he served in the Boer War, he served in the First World War, he volunteered for the Second World War, but was too old by that stage, and served in the fire service and was quite badly injured when a factory collapsed on him. I remember that one of the last days that I went round to see him and his wife, the Falklands War had just broken out, and his wife and my great-grandmother, who was only a little woman, turned around and said, I suppose you're going to bloody volunteer for that and all that. Because kept on disappearing for sort of years on end. But he's great character, a lot of common sense, and he was one of the greatest influences on me politically because he just thought socialism, as being propounded by the Keir Hardys of the world, was actually going to be a disaster for the working man. He was very much a believer in self-reliance and responsibility. In terms of academic influences, I've lived for many years in a village called Rington in Somerset, where John Locke was born, who influenced virtually everybody that was involved with the founding of the American state. And my other great hero, and I'm still yet to get to Monticello, is Thomas Jefferson, a great thinker And in the light of what we've got going on at the moment, obviously a racist needs to have his statue pulled down. So they're the three main influences. I mean, my great-grandfather, he thought Margaret Thatcher made a fundamental mistake in putting all power away from town councils, county councils, city councils, and investing it all in Whitehall, controlled by just a few men. He thought this was an utter disaster at the time. I remember him fulminating on that. And at the end of the day, he was right. I mean, literally what we're going through now, we've probably got a group of 16 people who are dictating to the rest of the country where they can go, what they can do, who they can sleep with, and what they can eat. A terrible state of affairs. So they're the three major influences: Jefferson, my great-grandfather, and John Locke.
Are you worried about some of the issues from his era that were so strongly held? What are the threats to our freedom of speech and expression arising from the current events?
I actually posted online today, and I've got a couple of degrees in politics and history for my sins. I actually pointed out to somebody who was just saying that the events in Bristol was fully deserved. And I said, you do realise that 40% of the nation's budget in 1833, I think 34, was actually spent on abolishing slavery. And that didn't even include, and I've actually been there in Sierra Leone, the West African flotilla that was based in Freetown, which was where a lot of slaves actually went, and that's the reason why it's called Freetown. And one of my fellow directors based in South Africa, one of his ancestors received a knighthood for his work in abolishing slavery. So 200 years ago, this issue was largely knocked on the head. And Sol, who's a Black American thinker, he's absolutely firmly convinced that this thing about race is being whipped up beyond belief to actually serve a political purpose. I think after 200 years of abolishing the slave trade still exists in Africa and the Middle East. I've actually seen it myself when I was working there. But at the end of the day, this is all being engineered. And the moment that Tony Blair said, I'm going to concentrate on education, I knew we were sunk, because we were just going to go for prejudice. And we are not working for equality of opportunity amongst the races. We are actually fostering hate, not hope. And after 200 years, I think we need to move on from this. And I'm appalled the fact that Black American police officers are being shot by other Black antagonists involved in this Antifa regime of hate that's going on in America. I was frankly appalled, but not surprised at what went on in Bristol this weekend. I hope that saner heads will actually see through this. I'm pretty appalled by the mayor of Bristol welcoming 10,000 people into Bristol towards the end of a COVID epidemic. He did exactly the same over the Greta Thunberg, where there were thousands trampling on College Green. It's anything for a vote. And literally, I sometimes question how these people actually manage to actually get into positions of political power. It's obviously not by having the brain the size of a planet.
Considering that so many people are choosing liberty over everything else, what's the major draw factor for the Libertarian Party? How does it challenge the obsolete political model, and why should people get on board with the party as opposed to the mainstream?
I think because literally you ask anybody about their politics, you'll either get one answer, oh, my granddad voted Labour, so I'm voting Labour. Even that's actually going out the window now because of Brexit. You get the staunch Tory, I'm voting Tory because I don't want to see Corbyn in. So at the end of the day, you're not voting for something, you're actually voting to stop something. And literally now people are actually saying to me, we've now got to the stage where I can't be bothered with either of them. And the biggest party that actually achieved success at the last election was the 42% that didn't vote at all because they just washed their hands of the whole system. And I think that's a worry when democracy is not a great system, but it's the best out of all the ones that are actually going. And for people to wash their hands of something that's been fought for since Naseby, which I'll quickly add there that one of my ancestors raised a troop of cavalry and fought there. But, you know, at the end of the day, we've got to not only fight for democracy, but that democracy has also got to be relevant. And going back to my earlier point about Margaret Thatcher sucking all power into Whitehall, part of our party policy is that everything has to be devolved out. We've had a situation where Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales have been rowing their own boat on this, and we've been taking instructions from London when the epicentres of this infection were London, Birmingham and the Northwest. Why they are there, I pretty much guess it's due to poverty and overcrowding, but literally why Wessex, I'm a great fan of having a Wessex regional government, why we were being suborned to London rules and dictated to when we had an extremely low infection rate and an extremely low death rate. Now, at the end of the day, I'm speaking to you from France at the moment. I'm in what is called the green zone. The green zone is the area of the country where there is very little infection, there is very little cause for concern, but over towards Paris, all around Paris and out towards the Belgian border, that's the red zone where they have got differential restrictions. Now, at the end of the day, if that doesn't shout volumes as to why we need to have devolution in England, I don't know what is. And I think it is having the guy who's got some power over your life that you can actually bump into in Tesco's rather than driving past in a bulletproof limousine in Whitehall. I think that is going to be the way of the future. And I think more people are actually catching on to this. It doesn't help that the BBC absolutely loathes and detests libertarians. We used to have a regular slot on the BBC. I actually got asked to do a 10-minute slot on the BBC and remained on for over an hour because people were phoning in like crazy. Not long after that, and this I'm now talking 10 years ago, that all the invitations from the BBC completely and utterly dried up. So if you want an example of why the BBC is part of the state system and who it's actually working for, I can offer that one as a supporting argument.
But the future's bright for the rest of us.
Yeah, of course it is. You've always got to be optimistic.
Well, that's about it for this edition of the Libertarian Listener. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining me, Andrew.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for taking the time.
Listeners might be very keen to know that next week there's going to be a lockdown discussion between representatives of 4 parties within the UK. So you've got that to look forward to. And until then, thank you for listening.